just having fun.
As we revised the macroeconomics, it was like there are two students there at that time, so they had to say macroeconomics again.
Yeah.
Audio course.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Không, cho bạn mình
gì đó đúng không? Ủa gì vậy?
chửi luôn.
Thì chọn ai thì chọn con mẹ đó thì chọn.
Chửi đúng rồi.
Con mẹ đó, con mẹ đó.
So this clock is 1 minute late. It is 1 minute late.
Cậu ăn bữa đây. Mở đây là hát bài không biết bài như vậy. Hát bài của tỉnh khoảng cách thôi, cả các con tỉnh. Anh coi múa môi đã là MC một biết. Anh coi là anh coi là phải đó.
Unfortunately, I have to end this session as well. We have to, every time I change something, I turn this off, or I change lecture, I have to stop the video. This is very bad. Seems we have to do that. Okay. So we talked about risk aversion, the problems of asset risk aversion, prudence and precautionary saving. We did for the macro course, so I'll just remind you. So basically the idea is that we have a certain level of expected income, and then we introduce a mean preserving spread. We introduce uncertainty about that future expected income. And then this creates under certain conditions, this creates the need for precautionary saving, for extra saving. And these are two types of conditions. One is a condition on preferences of the utility function, and the other is the possible presence of borrowing constraints. So, but the condition of the utility function is this prudence that we derived last time as well, in macro as well. And it is distinct from risk aversion. So this is the example I have given you. So somebody gets W, this endowment of W, initially, say wealth, and then they decide how much to save, and W minus X they consume, and then in the second period they get this X because there is a zero interest rate, plus they get a certain amount of income. And in the first instance, this is a guaranteed Y bar, no uncertainty. And then the problem is maximize this thing with respect by choice of X. So you get the first order condition, you equate the marginal utility of first period consumption with the expected marginal utility of second period consumption. And then when you plot these things, as you recall, we can plot them as a function of X, and because of diminishing marginal utility, we have an upward slope in marginal utility. The higher the X, the smaller the consumption, so the higher the marginal utility. And here you have the expected marginal utility of X plus Y bar, so the higher the X, the lower the actual utility U prime, but this is true for all possible realizations. So it's also true for expected utility, which is the weighted average of the possible marginal utilities with respect to the probabilities, right? So that is downward sloping, and there is this point of intersection, and here we have equality. We satisfy the first order condition, and this gives us the optimal level of saving, okay? And then you go to the next stage and you introduce this mean preserving spread. So with the simplest one is with probability 50% you get plus epsilon 1 with probability 50% minus epsilon 1, so that preserves the mean, right? But you could have even a continuous probability distribution, or you could have more realizations. The important thing is the expected value of epsilon tilde should be 0. So, and there should be a finite variance. And then if we are going to find higher optimal saving in this, after we introduce this mean preserving spread, the income risk, this extra saving, of course, will be the precautionary saving we are looking for, right? So the diagram must look this way if we are going, because, by introducing the mean preserving spread, we are not touching this function over here. We are changing this function. So if we know that the old x star is this, and if we know that this function is stable, doesn't shift, the only way we can get extra, we can get precautionary saving, is if this curve shifts to the right. So this must be the case, right? And then this is precautionary saving. Okay, and now then the question becomes, what are the properties of U, of the utility function, such that if I add a mean preserving spread here, expected marginal utility goes up. And since we are talking, the important thing contrasting with risk aversion is we are talking about marginal utility, not about total expected marginal utility, not about expected utility. So we have to consider properties of marginal utility. Okay, so this is what we want to happen. So let's translate this marginal utility to be f. Let's call it f of x plus epsilon tilde here. Here, yeah. This y bar doesn't matter because it's constant, so we can subsume it over there. And greater than expectation of f of some number x. Okay, so we have simplified. And here we have the three cases. We have the concave marginal utility, so f double prime is negative. And if this is, you see, this looks like the risk aversion diagram, but it's not, because this is now marginal utility, right? Not total utility, marginal utility. So we have, if we get x for sure, this is our marginal utility. If we introduce the mean preserving spread that I talked about, these are the two possible cases. So the midpoint, you know, if it's 50% probability for one, 50% for the other, we have to go to the midpoint, and that's the expected marginal utility, the expected f of x plus mean preserving spread. And we see that in this case, this is lower. So we introduce the epsilon tilde, and instead of getting it to be higher as we want over here, we're getting it to be lower, right? So this can't be right. This is not what it should look like. This is what it should look like. It should be a convex function. So f double prime should be positive. And we have the low, we have the high, and this is expected marginal utility. And you see that with this mean preserving spread here, expected marginal utility has gone up, right? Relative to this. So this is the marginal utility should be a convex function, so the second derivative of marginal utility should be positive, which means the third derivative of the total utility should be positive. And if we had linear utility function, 0 f double second derivative, we wouldn't get any effect. We wouldn't generate any precautionary saving. And that would be the case of zero prudence, right? Somebody who doesn't care about the riskiness of income. So here is the condition. If we are going to get a condition from the utility function, then it is this triple derivative of the utility function must be positive. But this is a sufficient condition, it's not a necessary condition for precautionary saving. We could have the possibility of binding borrowing constraints in the future. So you know that in the future, you may want to borrow and you may not be able to borrow because you are exhausting the limit, you are exhausting the constraint. So for that reason, even if your utility function doesn't have a positive third derivative, for that reason, you may decide to engage in precautionary saving. Okay. So that's the a measure of prudence. We saw it in macro. It looks like risk aversion with one absolute risk aversion with one derivative up, right? And we normalize again so as to avoid this problem with affine transformations. But here again, this measure is positive, but not because, and we have to put a minus to make it positive, not because of the numerator, because the numerator must be positive, the third derivative, but because of the denominator, which we know is negative when we have a concave utility function, when we have risk aversion, this second derivative is negative, so we need the minus to cancel that and make this a positive number. Now, why do we want to make it a positive number? Because we want to be able to say a higher measure of prudence means more precautionary saving. So it's a matter of taste. No? And here is our CARA, constant absolute risk aversion utility function. And we have to compute the optimal saving here, and that was also in the exam, I believe, no? So here is a random walk for income, and you get the result of this form. And the important thing here is that you have these three determinants of precautionary saving, right? So the one determinant is sigma squared, so you get more precautionary saving the more background risk you face, right? The other determinant is alpha, which is prudence for the constant absolute risk aversion utility function. So the bigger the alpha, the bigger the precautionary saving. And the third determinant is how many years you have left. Yeah? You have a question? No, you don't have a question. You're combing yourself. Okay, very good. Very good. Keep combing, no problem. So how many years you have ahead of you, and the intuitive reason for this is that as you're growing older, the number of work years, labor years you have ahead of you goes down, right? So you are facing less and less background income risk. So you need to save less and less for precautionary reasons. Okay? So that's the justification for that. Okay. And if you were to do quadratic utility to solve the problem with quadratic utility, but here we have to allow for a rate of interest equal to the rate of time preference, it can't be zero, then you get a result like this. And this is a fraction, and this is a fraction. Your optimal consumption is a fraction of your total wealth, which is your financial wealth plus your human wealth, the expected present value of future labor income. And the key thing to note here is that you don't see a sigma squared. So variance doesn't enter optimal consumption. The only thing that matters is the expected present value of future income. And if you introduce mean preserving spreads that maintain the expected future income value, then you're not changing consumption, right? And then you say, how come? Well, with quadratic utility, the third derivative of the utility function is zero. So prudence is zero, right? So the precautionary motive is, simply not there. Okay, now we go to how do we test for the presence of prudence. And it's not so simple, it's not so easy. There are different approaches, and people, have not found necessarily huge effects, but they have found effects, depending, with some methods, more with others. So one way to do it is to ask people, right, in a survey, what are the reasons for saving? What are the reasons you have for saving? And typically people will tell you as one of the reasons that they are saving for a rainy day. This doesn't work very well in Vietnam where you have rain every day now, right? But if it's once in a blue moon, once in a while, then you are saving for a rainy day. But the idea is, I'm saving in case a shock occurs, right? And it could be an income shock, it could be an expenditure shock, it could be a health shock. So all of these things that are in the background that you cannot insure against, and maybe you can insure against health, it would have to be an out-of-pocket health expenditure shock. So the part of health expenditure that you cannot insure for, right? So that must be what you're talking about. And then I have set aside some assets, financial assets, so as to use them, run them down, and maintain my consumption, either at the same level as before, as without the shock, or to lower it less than I would have had to lower it with the shock, right? So that's the idea of this precautionary wealth buffer. There is this term, precautionary wealth buffer, and it is, saving for a rainy day, saving for an unexpected, uncontrolled background shock that makes you have to spend more. Okay. So that's the direct one. The other possibility is a proxy for background income risk. So proxy for background income risk, and it depends on the survey. So if the survey is a panel data, right, and you have done also panel data econometrics, no? You have? Yes. You have done panel data econometrics. So if it's a long panel data, like the panel PSID, panel study of income dynamics, I will list it, then you have many years of data. You're following the same households over time. So you have many years of labor income data. So maybe you can use these data to estimate the process for labor income, right? For households of a certain education level, typically, and controlling for age, right? And then you can estimate based on that, econometric estimation, you can estimate the background risk that people face, right? And then you can plug in that background risk into the survey data, into the even cross-sectional data, and you can test the hypothesis that households that face higher background risk, right, higher estimated background risk, are saving more, right? So you can do a saving, if you have data on saving, active saving, Y minus income minus consumption, you can regress active saving on different characteristics and on this background income shock, the background income risk. Or if you have data for wealth, say the wealth to income ratio or something, you can regress that on the characteristics plus this extra control for background risk. And in either of these cases, it should be that higher background risk is associated with higher precautionary wealth, higher wealth to income ratio, or a higher saving to income ratio, right? So that would be supportive of the presence of precautionary saving, right? Now, I'm not going to go through, read through this, but I have just listed household level survey data on portfolios for future reference, if you become interested in this, in this research area, etc. So you have some general population, a lot of general population data. So the best known one is for the US, the US Survey of Consumer Finances. This is PSID that I told you. It doesn't have the best portfolio data. It does have some, but it has great income data over time. And then you have others. So this is for Italy. Since 1960s, Italy is collecting such data. This is the Dutch National Survey, the Bank of Spain is very good. This is the German survey. Then, okay, so these are representative of the total population. Then you go to older households, 50 plus, and you only interview households that are headed by people 50 plus, right? So these are the older households. And you drop all the rest. You don't have data on the young, you have only on those. And these data sets are focused more on pension, retirement issues. They are focused on health issues as well. So you get measures of subjective health. So they ask people, how do you feel? You know, how would you rate your health? But of course you have the problem that some people are miserable and pessimistic, and they tell you, oh, I'm dying, and actually, you know, they are doing pretty well. So that's a subjective health. But they also measure objective health, these data sets, which is fantastic. So they ask you to walk through the room, and they measure how fast you can walk. Or they ask you how many activities of daily life you have problems with. So can you get out of the bed? Can you dress yourself? Can you go down the stairs, etc.? You know, and you may be thinking, oh, you know, are these problems? These are not problems for you, but the data set starts at 50, right? So and it goes, I think, you know, sometimes the oldest person responded there is 103 or something like that. So then it becomes really very important to ask them if they can go down the stairs and whatever else. So this is fantastic data for these things. Now it does have the problem that it starts late, right? So you don't observe these people, and these are panel data, so they follow the same people all the time. You don't observe them when they are young, right? You start observing them later. But there is at least one, and I think maybe two, of these waves where they ask people their life history. So they ask them questions about what happened early on in their lives. So for example, did you grow up in a rich household? Did you have lots of books when you were growing up? How educated were your parents? You know, maybe what occupation did your parents have? Did you live in a rural area, in an urban area? So there are background questions like that that can be, you know, very useful, but they're not asked in every sample. And of course, because this is panel, right, you ask them once about their past, and then you can apply it wherever you see in all observations, future observations, or past observations of that household, you can apply the life history, right? But the problem is that people die, people get out of the survey, so there is attrition in the survey, and then you bring in fresh people, and maybe you haven't asked them about the past. So that's, you know, the problems can start. Now, a more recent development, much more recent development that started in the 2010s, I would say, I believe, are surveys just of expectations. And now this is a hot thing for central banks as well. So it started with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I mean, okay, let me backtrack. There has been a survey in the US which has been going on forever, you know, for many decades, and that's the survey at Michigan, the Michigan survey of households. And it does include expectations, that survey. But the modern ones that are totally focused on expectations are the ones I'm talking about here. The New York Fed survey is the first one. So Michigan surveys have been around for some time. but for the recent ones, the New York Fed survey, there is an ECB survey, there is also a Bundesbank survey, and these are now proliferating. And you know, the central banks are very interested in inflation expectations. So they ask a lot about inflation expectations. And we saw in macro why they care, right? Because they want to see if inflation expectations are anchored to the target or if they are unanchored, right? So what better way to do that than to ask people what inflation they expect? And the other thing they ask them about is perceived inflation, past inflation. So what was inflation last year, right, over the past year? And, you know, that's a Googleable event. You can Google it, right? And still people exhibit enormous heterogeneity in perceptions of past inflation. So not only a lot of heterogeneity in future expectations, but also in perceptions of past inflation, which is surprising. Okay, so let's go back to testing for prudence. I told you measure of labor income risk, econometrically estimated. I went through that. If you have, like PSID, if you have these long series of income data, you can estimate the income risk associated with different households. But maybe you don't have that, and what you have is the occupation. Maybe it is even cross-sectional data, or even you know, if it's a short panel, you have the occupation of the person, of the household head or the financially responsible person. Let me say, since I mentioned it, it used to be we were asking who is the household head, and you would interview the household head, right? But this is, all the women here will agree that this is a tough question, right? So I had a great-grandmother who used to say, you know, in the early 1900s she lived, so my mother told me this, she used to say the head of the household is the man and the woman is the neck. So the woman turns the head wherever she wants, right? But the head, the head is the man. Okay, but these issues now are very old-fashioned. So you don't go to a household and say who is the head here. I mean, it looks really terrible. So now how we describe things is what we ask is, who is the person responsible for finances, most knowledgeable about finances, right? Who is the person in the household that knows most? And then we interview that person, which makes sense because you want accurate information, right? And we don't go into head or not head. Okay, so the occupation, and you know, normally we get if both people are working, if it is a household with two partners, we get the occupation of both. And then you put an occupational dummy, right, in the regression, and you should be finding that riskier occupations are associated with higher wealth or higher saving. So when you're looking at farmers versus civil servants, you should be finding that farmers are saving more, you know, have more proportionate saving than civil servants with guaranteed income, you know, pension. Salaries. Okay, and then you know, in terms of estimates, measures of labor income risk, there is a third possibility, which is you cannot estimate, you don't have enough data to estimate the income risk. And maybe you want to do better than the general occupation. Because the problem with occupation is, you know, you are asking university professors, you know, you observe as occupation university professors, right? And and then you treat all university professors the same. But maybe I know that, you know, next year I'm getting a promotion. It has already been voted, right? I'm getting an income increase, etc. And maybe somebody else doesn't know. He's still waiting to see if they are going to get tenure or if they are going to get a promotion to full professor and stuff like that. But you are treating us the same, right? Just based on our occupation, you are treating us the same. But if you know, an alternative is to ask us, right? So, what is the level of income you expect to have next year? You told us this year you got this much. Last year you got this much. How much do you expect to earn next year? And then the person, you know, and nowadays, the way we ask expectational questions is we don't just ask for a point estimate. Okay, so let me backtrack. Let me tell you what used to happen. So you can just ask what is the expected value of your income, and you get a point estimate. And then you can ask how certain are you about that. And somebody would say, you know, if I know I'll get the raise or the promotion, I will tell you 100% certain. The other person expects to get a promotion but is not certain, would tell you, you know, I'm not so sure. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is to, and we do this now, especially with inflation expectations and interest rate expectations and things like that in the modern surveys, we ask people, we give them a distribution of possible values of inflation, right? So we say inflation will go up by 1%. Inflation will go up between 1 and 5%, 5 and 10%, 10 and 20, I don't know what, okay? Or will go down by this much, this much, this much. So we give them bins, right? Possible ranges. And then we ask them, you have 100 balls, distribute them across the bins and put more balls in the more likely outcome, okay? So effectively what we are asking people to do is to give us a probability distribution, a subjective probability distribution of what's going to happen to inflation next year, and another one for interest rate, etc. So once we have that, we can compute expected inflation, and we can compute the subjective variance, the uncertainty around that expectation, and we could do the same for income. Okay, so what, you know, your income is going to be the same, your income is going to go up between 0 and 5%, 5 and 10%, etc., and recover a whole distribution. Right? So that's an important possibility that we have, and we do it. So this, whatever way you construct the risk measure, is it statistically significant? Then, you know, there is prudence. You do want to get to have a cold. This thing is giving me a cold. Why don't you do it to yourselves over there? You want me to catch a cold and to interrupt the course. That's right. Now I know. Now I know what you want to happen. Okay. Another interpretation is this side of the room is hotter than the other side of the room, right? And they need this temperature control system. Okay. So that's approach number one. Approach number two is, you know, again very modern. So suppose you find that something happens that increases with the variance income uncertainty for some people relative to others. So for example, last week, I'm giving you, you know, recent example. Last week, the Prime Minister of Greece went on TV and said, I want to abolish the permanence, the tenure of civil servants. Because, you know, for centuries, civil servants get a job for life. I think in Vietnam, right? It's, if you're a civil servant, can they fire you? I mean, if you kill somebody, they will fire you, but otherwise, can they fire you?
Yeah, they can. They so-called they discipline you. So
they discipline you.
Yeah, so it's like you are removed out of the parties, which means like
you are out. You're right. Yes, because there are. But you know, this is if you're a criminal or whatever, right? If you are found with a crime, but if you are not working hard,
it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get any kind of like criminal conviction. It can be like there can be a certain scandals, or maybe like the citizen like complain about you, then they will just discipline you and then put the case as like inconclusive or whatever.
Okay, so it has to be some sort of scandal. But suppose they give you 5 applications to go through, and you only do 3 and consistently 3, and your colleague does 7. Can they fire you because you are not very productive?
Not very likely.
Not very likely, yeah. So, but you know, the Prime Minister of Greece announced he wants to do that. He wants to do productivity checks, right? And the people who, you know, consistently don't perform, they should be kicked out. Okay. So that's a great time now to do econometric research in Greece and to, you know, on those civil servants, because they're now getting a little bit shaky and they should start saving more, right? So, but are they saving more, or are they hoping for a change in government, or that, you know, this thing doesn't get passed? And you can also think of, you know, this actually, what I told you, is a very good, econometrically very good experiment, because, you know, you had already decided to be a civil servant or not, so you had no idea. I mean, this is a complete surprise to everybody that this is being discussed now. So you allocated yourself to different occupations and professions, and now one profession is becoming uncertain. You know, the income risk goes up, and the others not. So one approach is to say there is an exogenous increase, you know, to relate the saving or the wealth of people to the background risk they face, following now this increase in risk, and to see if the people who experience this increase in risk are starting to save more. You know, a little bit more sophisticated is to do sort of difference in difference estimation. You have done this, no? Have you seen diff in diff estimation? Have people talked about that? Where you have some people who are treated, these, you know, something changed for them, this is the income risk they face, and you have other people who are not treated, didn't experience this exogenous increase in income risk. And you are measuring them, you're measuring their saving before they experience the change for both groups, treated and controlled. Then you implement the change, right? So the law gets passed, and you know, these civil servants lose the permanence of their income, their positions, right? And you measure the saving again, right? So, and then you compare the difference in the saving before and after the reform, right? Among people who were influenced by the reform, by the civil servants, and people who were not influenced by the reform. Because, you know, saving may be changing for all sorts of other reasons over time. So you want to take that as a basis, right? So the control group, the change in the saving of the control group tells you if saving is changing for other reasons over time. But you're controlling for that, and you are just looking at the difference relative to that, right? So where the people who were treated, who experienced the income risk increase, they raised their saving more compared to the other people, right? That did not experience it. And that would be, that would be a modern way to do that, to test for the presence of precautionary saving of precautionary wealth. And finally, these what I was talking about, the rainy day response to the survey. So right now, if you ask me what is the most modern, the thing that people do the most now is this second thing, the diff-in-diff type of approach. But of course, you can do good work with the other ones as well. The one thing that we used to be able to do and we are no longer able to do very much is to say, let's correlate income risk and wealth. I mean, this first approach, people may say, yeah, but maybe you chose to be in that occupation. You are choosing this, you chose to be in a riskier occupation, and you are saving more because of so you have some underlying characteristics, the unobserved heterogeneity argument, right? You have some underlying characteristics that make you choose a riskier occupation and at the same time make you choose to have higher wealth or to save more, right? So that's the reason, and you haven't shown us that there is a precautionary motive. So that is the unobserved heterogeneity. That's why people nowadays, a number of people, lots of people insist on exogenous variation. Can you find something that exogenously influences your income risk, and you can find the effect? And one way, of course, is to do the instrumental, if you can find a good instrument to instrument income risk with, then you can do this approach, more credibly. But if you cannot find a good instrument, just doing it, maybe will raise questions and criticism from the people who like this approach. And they call themselves the identification police. Have you heard this? The identification police. In other words, they come and they look at your paper and they say, okay, did you have truly exogenous variation? Do you have a good way to identify the effect? Or are you just doing correlations and, nothing more than simple correlations? Okay? So times have changed. Your life will be more difficult than my life. Okay. And now, most probably, I have to stop there. Let me pause it, at least. Okay. So, stop sharing. Now it seems to be working, so I don't need to stop. Very good. But I haven't shared. Share. Okay. Now you see this. Now I do this. Very good. Now it is working. We have found a way not to have 1,500 videos. Okay. so let's go through the stock market non-participation puzzle. Again, I'm going to remind you how we derived it, but then I will go, but I'll do this fast, and then we will go to the new discussion of solutions for the stock market non-participation puzzle, possible explanations. So, here we are considering, we start with a consumption saving model. We introduce many different assets. So this, for each of these assets that we introduce, we can have one riskless asset, not more than one, because if we have more than one riskless asset will be dominated, will not in return, will not be held. So we have one riskless asset and many risky assets, or we only have risky assets, that's also possible. For each of those, there is a first order condition that we have seen in the macro lecture on consumption. So if I take epsilon from this and from consumption, lower my current consumption by epsilon, put it in asset I, then this is what I expect, how much I expect my future utility to change, okay? And because this refers to next period utility, I have to discount by this beta discount factor. So this is the first order condition, and it is for all one for each asset. That helps me in the end, if I use n minus one of those, I can, if I can compute n minus one of those, then the residual will be the n plus. And I told you that portfolio implications are pretty ridiculous. In the traditional capital asset pricing model, everybody should be, not only should everybody be holding stocks, but everybody should be holding the market portfolio of stocks. So in other words, stocks, the way they are held by the market, right? The entire stock market and the weights that the stock market assigns to each risky, to each stock, right? And that is completely unrealistic in terms of the data. But even the simplest extension of consumption saving to two assets implies that everybody should be holding at least epsilon stocks. So King and Leap in 1987, Meinke and Zelders 91, and our paper, that got published in 95. That paper got rejected 7 times. I don't know if I told you last time. It got rejected 7 times, and every time, each referee had his own or her own idea about what could be causing stock market non-participation, and every time we were ruling it out and submitting. Anyway, so, but we sort of, all of these papers pointed to the fact that back then the data were not so accurate, so we were saying between 25–35% of US households were holding stocks in the early 80s, 1980s. There wasn't enough detail on mutual funds, on the composition of mutual funds, for us to know if all mutual fund holders back then in 83 were holding stocks. So we were not very sure. But at least, it was a small number. It was not 100%. And there was no way this would get to 100% with better data. So nowadays it's 53% for the US. 53% of US households are reported as holding stocks. So the puzzle here is very few households actually hold stocks, despite we did the equity premium, you remember, despite the fact that the covariance, despite the fact that, of course, stocks have an expected return premium, they have higher expected return. And if you remember the equity premium derivation and discussion, the data there was showing very small covariance of the consumption growth to aggregate consumption growth to the stock return. Okay? So in other words, you have stocks that are giving you an expected return premium and that they are not contributing very much to the riskiness of consumption. They have very low covariance with consumption, right? And you are still not holding. You know, the majority of the population doesn't hold it, right? So what's going on? So that is the stock holding function. And here, this is from the household portfolios volume, and this is the late 1990s now, the data. But why I'm showing you this is because it also has the evolution from the 80s to the, in the 80s and the 90s, the history of stock market participation. And the way this is constructed is, here are the proportions of households in each country that hold stocks directly. And then in the second panel, we add to these, we say what proportion of households hold stocks either directly or indirectly or at the same time, both, right? So this number cannot be smaller than, these numbers cannot be smaller than these numbers. You know, how much bigger, if they are bigger, and how much bigger tells us how many people only have indirect stock holding without direct stock holding, right? And then the third panel, we also include bonds, risky bonds, longer-term bonds. So these are still financial assets. And the fourth panel, we include housing and we include private businesses, right? So these are total risky assets. You have risky financial assets and risky real assets, okay? So some observations over here about the history of this. You see that direct stock holding in the US in the 80s and 90s hardly changed. So it started being about 19%, okay, fell a little bit, ended up 90. So this didn't take off. Stock market participation did not take off because people, a bigger fraction of people started holding stocks directly. However, when you introduce indirect stock holding, so these are also mutual funds. And for the case of the US, there are also retirement accounts in which you have stocks. For the other countries, we didn't have data on retirement accounts. But you see here that there is an explosion, right, in these 2 decades in the US. So from less than a third in 1989, we went to 50% by the end of the 90s, right? So in 11 years, in actually 10 years, we went from less than a third to a half of households. Now, we know this didn't happen because of direct stock holding, so it must have happened because of indirect stock holding, and actually because of people who were only holding stocks indirectly and not directly, right? And I can tell you one more detail that's not visible from this graph, which is it didn't happen so much from mutual funds. I mean, mutual funds, they remained around 25%, but it happened because people started including stocks in their retirement accounts, right? So the movement of defined benefit retirement accounts to defined contribution retirement accounts. Do you know have you heard of these terms? Defined benefit, defined contribution? Probably not. Okay. You have? No. The defined benefit pension plan, a defined benefit pension plan is, you know how much, I mean, you know, you have to make a monthly contribution to the pension plan, and then your pension is determined by a formula. So they look at how many years you work, they look at some other parameters that are in the formula, and they have to give you, no matter what, they have to give you that pension, right, at retirement age. So that's a defined benefit. The pension benefit is defined. And it is, which means that if they are investing your contributions in the stock market, in bonds, wherever they are investing, and the market goes down, the provider of the pension bears all the risk, right? They still have to deliver the pension that's determined by the formula, right? They are bearing the risk, you are not bearing the risk, the pensioner or the saver. The industry or the government is bearing the risk, right? So that's a defined benefit pension plan. A defined contribution pension plan is one in which you decide how much to invest every month, and then they take this money and they put it in a mutual fund, and you also have some choice. Most likely you also can choose how much to put in stocks, how much to put in the riskless assets, etc., right? And then the market runs between the time you make the investment and the time you retire. And if the market is doing very well, then you're going to get a bigger pension. You're going to be able to buy more annuities with the money. If the market is going down, is not doing well at all, you are the loser, right? Nobody has to give you a pension of a particular level, right? So this is the defined contribution pension plan where the risk is borne by the saver. It is not borne by the government or by the pension industry, okay? So what happened in the US and what is happening, in other financially developed countries, but not in all. I mean, it's not happening in Greece, for example, but it is happening in Germany up to a certain extent. It is happening in the Netherlands, it is happening in other European countries, but not, and of course it's happening a lot in the UK, but not in all countries. There is a shift away from defined benefit plans to defined contribution. Okay. So, as a result of this shift, or associated with this shift, is the increase in stock holding through indirect holdings of stock. Okay? Now, this is also, we're talking about stocks, but since you have not been introduced to these concepts, and household finance is where you should be introduced to these concepts. This is the place. So let me also make a digression and tell you about the 3 pillars of the pension system. Do you know? Has anybody talked? Probably not. 3 pillars of the pension system. So the first pillar is Social Security taxes, Social Security contributions. And you must have Social Security in Vietnam. So if you will get jobs, no way. So when you get your job, right? When you get your job, you start making mandatory contributions to the Social Security fund. And the government accumulates these contributions. And when your time comes to retire, then they are giving you Social Security pension, right? And of course, there are some restrictions. You have to have a minimum year of employment, how many years you work for, etc., etc. And these also tend to be, a large part of these tends to be proportional to your contributions, a large part of the pension proportional to your contribution. So this is the first pillar of the pension system, right? And it used to be the case in financially developed countries that the government was not investing your money. What the government was doing was It was taxing the working people, the working people in a year. They were taxing the working people, Social Security taxes. The working people would pay these contributions, and then the government would divide these contributions among the pensioners, right? So this is a so-called unfunded pension system in which the government is just taxing in a year and distributing in that year. It's not putting your contributions into a fund. It's not saving your contributions for later. Okay? It's taxing the working people, distributing to the pension. Now, for this system to work, the population of working people must be considerably larger than the population of pensioners, right? Because you want, what do I mean to work? The system to work. You have to give adequate pensions, right? So you are taxing the working people, maybe, I don't know, 2.5%, 3%, 5%, something like that of their salary. You're taxing them to give to the pensioners, right? If the pensioners are more than the working people, right? What are they going to get? They're going to get less than 2.5%, 3%, 5% of the salary of the working people. That's not a pension, that's a joke, right? So this can no longer work in countries where there are many retirees relative to working people. And unfortunately, the US and all of Europe are like that. But I think Vietnam is a young country, isn't it? Yes? So you don't have such a big problem yet, right? So keep producing babies. Keep producing babies, because you start doing, you say, I've done my part. I know, you're done, yes, I know. But, the input to your baby production was 2 people, and you have produced 2 people as output. The output should be more than the input. Anyway, I've done the same, but anyway. So the countries in which there is a demographic transition, and it's no demographic problem, more is needed. So you have pillar 2. So pillar 2, that you may also or may not have, you will tell me, are the occupational pension plans. Okay? So the teachers have a pension plan. The, doctors have another, the lawyers have another, occupational, it goes by occupation. And you make contributions to these pension plans. And then these used to be defined benefit pension plans. The occupational pension plans, the Social Security is normally defined benefit, it's a formula, right? Occupational pension plans used to be defined benefit also in the US and in Europe, right? With a formula. And the big transition that you are seeing in these data in the US was from defined benefit occupational plans to defined contribution occupational plans. Right? So that's what was happening there. And there is some transition in a number of European countries as well, but not necessarily much. My pension plan as a high civil servant in Germany is a formula, is defined benefit. So I'm going to get a formula. It's not a defined contribution pension plan. So Germany itself will also have to make more of a transition in the coming years, but they haven't done it yet. So this is the second pillar, occupation. Do you have occupational pension plans? So the guy who has had an economic life back in the back, you have had an economic life. The others are youngsters, right? So do you know this? Is there an occupational pension plan? So while you were working, you know, you were taxed Social Security taxes, right? You were paying Social Security taxes. Were you also paying to a fund for your occupation, separate contributions? No.
No.
So maybe you don't have that. Yeah, maybe you don't have that. But that's the second pillar, right? And it works very well when the first pillar is in a mess because of the demographic transition. So maybe that's why you don't have it. And then there is a third pillar that the US has developed, even Germany has developed to some extent. You know, Greece hasn't developed, and I'm very upset. Okay, the third pillar are individual retirement accounts, private retirement accounts. So you go to an insurance company and you buy a pension retirement, you know, a retirement account product, you know, offered by the insurance company, the private insurance company. So you start making contributions. It works like the occupational one. It's a defined contribution pension plan. You start making contributions, and you have a choice. Typically, you have a choice of how much risk to take in those, right? In the investment that is being made with your funds. And then the private insurance company, when you reach retirement age, is going to, sometimes it gives you the option to take the money and run, right? Or in Germany, very often it doesn't give you that option. So the money that you put in is not taxed. I mean, that's important. It's not taxed when you receive it. So if you're getting part of your income, you are contributing to this private pension product, you are not paying taxes on that part that you are contributing, right? But you pay taxes on when you get the pension. You know what I mean? Mm. But that's good for you, because for two reasons. First, later is better than sooner, okay? So there's a discount factor there. And the other good news for you is that, you know, pension income is lower than your working income, typically, right? Except for the start of your career, maybe, whatever. So your tax rate, your progressive tax rate is going to be lower when you actually get taxed for this, right? So this is called tax deferral, not tax exemption. It's not tax exemption. This is a deferred tax deferred instrument, not a tax exempt instrument. But you're benefiting first because you are paying later, and second, and if you are lucky, you die and you never pay. Okay, but later is better than sooner, and the other thing is, of course, that you will be taxed at a lower rate. Okay, so that's the third pillar. But normally, private insurance companies enter this pillar if there is this tax deferral. So the government needs to move first to introduce the tax incentive, and then it makes, you know, these products and what they can guarantee you very attractive, right? Because, you know, if you have, like in Germany, the marginal tax rate, you know, for high earning is 44%. So out of each euro, you are paying 44 cents to taxes. But if you use that euro, you put it in your private insurance, then you're using the whole euro, and that is what gets reinvested and everything, right? So it really makes a huge difference. And it's a big tax incentive. Okay, first pillar, Social Security. Second pillar, occupational pension plans. Third pillar, private retirement accounts. Okay, now you know it, and I can continue with stockholding here. Okay. So what do you see in the UK? In the UK, unlike the US, all the action was in the 80s. All the action was in the direct stockholding, and not so much in indirect stockholding. We don't see much of action there. What happened in the UK? Margaret Thatcher happened in the UK. You know Margaret Thatcher? Yes. You have watched the film?
Iron Lady.
You should watch the film also, The Iron Lady, and everything, yeah? So she was devious, very smart. So she was a conservative politician, right? And she wanted to pass legislation in favor of industry. And there was, in the UK, a very powerful labor movement, lots of trade unions, right, that were not going to agree to all sorts of legislation favoring industry. So her big idea was, let's make workers into capitalists. And how do you do that? You encourage workers to buy stocks. And once they buy stocks, they are entitled to get dividends, part of the profits of industry. And they become friendlier to pro-industry legislation that's going to generate more profits for industry because they are hoping to cash in. You see what I mean? So very deep, do you see how she was thinking? Very devious, right? Let's make workers into capitalists. So what she did was she imported American economists like Milton Friedman and others to talk about the stock market and stocks and capitalism and how great it is, you know, to the British people. And specifically what she wanted to do, because she was trying to kill many birds with one stone, she wanted to privatize public utilities, like the electricity company, the water company, etc. She wanted to privatize them, or the telephone company. She wanted to privatize those, right? And but to privatize them meant that she would have to sell stocks, right? Those companies would go on the stock market and people would have to buy these stocks, okay? So she was encouraging the people to buy stocks of privatized public utilities, saying, look at this, you know, this is a public utility, electricity, of course there is demand for electricity and there will always be demand for electricity. There's always demand for telephones. You can't possibly go wrong, right, by buying stocks in these privatized utilities, right, public utilities. So, that was the campaign, and you see that she really got results. So from less than 9% of the people, she got about, you know, more than 20% of the people holding stocks directly. These are the public utility stocks. Now, she was also hoping that this would spread to other stocks, to mutual funds. There wasn't much of that happening. People stuck with the stocks that they bought, and we now understand this, that there's a lot of inertia and people don't like to move around and all of this. But that's what happened there, and much less, you know, indirect stockholding. And then you see Germany much lower, and Italy much lower stock market participation rates and not much action in the 80s and 90s. You go to indirect stockholding, as I said, except for the US, that included retirement accounts. These are just mutual funds, direct stocks and mutual funds. And what you see is comparing, you know, these numbers. You see some action, but limited action, especially in Italy, but also in Germany. Limited action in terms of indirect stockholding. Then you introduce bonds, hardly any action. Bonds are not very popular with households. But when you introduce, of course, real estate and private businesses, you get a lot more action, right? But compare and contrast the US and Italy. you get huge action in Italy, right? Which means what? That there are lots of Italians, or there were in those periods, but it continues even today, lots of Italians who owned a house or owned a private business, right? Sorry, yes. So let me be, yeah. So now I realize I should be even sharper with respect to the housing. Total risky assets is not the primary residence. This does not include the house you live in, right? This does not include the house you live in. It includes other real estate, which means plots of land that you may have. It means second, third homes, whatever. Maybe it's your vacation home that you are not renting out, but it's still classified in the US data as investment real estate, in the sense that you could be renting it out. Even if you're not renting it out, you could be renting it out, so it's part of investment real estate. So what you see here, to be very precise, is directly held stocks, indirectly held stocks, investment real estate, people who have something other than the primary residence in real estate, and private business, okay? So I was not so clear before relative to what I was saying before. You take out the primary residence. I didn't stress that. You take out the primary residence, ownership of primary residence. Okay, so what you see is there are lots of Italians, or there were lots of Italians who had investment real estate and or private business and had no stocks directly or indirectly held, right? That's the difference between these two numbers, right? But there are very few, by comparison, US households who had investment real estate or private business that didn't have stocks directly or indirectly, right? So you are beginning to see a difference in the equity culture, the stock culture between the US and Italy, and we're going to see this very clearly when we do the international comparisons. Okay. This I had shown you. I'm not going to go through it again. The orange things are participation rates. Remember the big difference between this paper and this book, this chapter here, is that in this chapter where we were using population-wide data, right, representative of the entire population. And in this journal article, the Review of Economic Statistics, we are using the 50-plus samples, the 50-plus data sets, right? So you should expect to see bigger participation rates among the 50-plus than in the representative, the population-wide data set, because the young typically don't hold many assets, right? Mm-hmm. They are starting to save. So these numbers are slightly higher than the numbers would have been for the population-wide. And of course, the conditional amount, especially the median and 75th percentile, are going to be higher in this type of data set compared to, the population-wide data set. But here we don't have, we only have participation rates. Here we also have the conditional amounts. And you see that generally there is stock market non-participation. Okay, so let's do the break here, and then I'll